You're supposed to copy and paste your quick write into this box right here. So here's an example of what a student has written. They do already have a quote included in their response, so I'm going to bold that. Then you're supposed to include, copy and paste the evidence that should be included in your response. So here's the evidence that they included. And then I'm going to go get more evidence from that day's materials. So this is responding to the stories we tell ourselves. We read this earlier this week. The quote that they already chose was this green quote right here. And so I'm just going to grab a different quote that I'm then going to add to the response after I revise what they've written so far. So I'm just going to take this quote from a different section of the article. I'm going to put that there also in quotes. And then I'm going to follow the steps in order. So you're supposed to copy and paste the quick write again, put it into this box. And then first, do you already have evidence included in your writing? So the answer there is yes. So we don't have to do this step quite yet. We will do it in a minute when you do the steps all over again. You do them twice. So we do have evidence. That's the bolded quote. And I'm going to turn it green. That's this quote right here so that you know which one I'm working with. And then do you make sure that it's surrounded by quotation marks? Check. And then do we hear the quote? Make sure it's trimmed to 3 to 8 words. So hearing the quote would mean it's so choppy or it's dropped there in a complete sentence. And then you can tell that the quote is there because it doesn't flow with your own writing. So I need to trim this quote down to much shorter. So the quote, well, first let me read you the whole response. So the stories we tell are influenced by our values because what we value determines what parts of the story we emphasize. Depending on who our audience is, we may want to seem funny or interesting, so we change the story to highlight those details. Then we have our quote. We do deceive ourselves about certain aspects of who we are and what we're doing. Such self-deception involves, among other things, the expressions of values we are unwilling to acknowledge. So how do I trim that down? What's the most important part of the quote that I want to keep? So deceiving ourselves is important. So we deceive ourselves about, and then I'm just going to remove the whole middle part. So we deceive ourselves about values that we are unwilling to acknowledge. When we remove things from a quote, we use ellipses, which is a ... So how long is it now? So we do deceive ourselves about values that we are unwilling to acknowledge. So that's 12 words. It's too long still. So we can get rid of we do. We can put that in our own words and build the sentence ahead of the quote. Deceive ourselves about values. We can remove that. We are unwilling to acknowledge. Deceive ourselves about values we are unwilling to acknowledge. That's 9. Close enough. So it doesn't have to be perfectly 8. That's just a general rule so that you're not quoting a whole sentence at a time. You want to quote small pieces, as small as possible. So this is fine. We just got to build the sentence ahead of it. That's the next step. So is the evidence properly introduced? As of now, no. We're going to add stuff in front of it. So, and we highlight only the traits we desire. We also deceive ourselves about values we're unwilling to acknowledge. So we do have some kind of introduction. It does recommend 2 to 3 sentences before the quote, though, so I'm going to add like a transition sentence so it flows a little bit more. So depending on who our audience is, we may want to seem funny or interesting, so we change the story to highlight those details. This would also include downplaying story details that we find embarrassing or shameful. Now we have 2 sentences, and we're building up to that quote, right? Then the next step, do you follow the quote with clarification? So we deceive ourselves about values we're unwilling to acknowledge. And then we say we might even try to emphasize qualities we don't actually have. So it just kind of moves on. There's no elaboration on that quote. So we want to make sure that we have interpretation, which is explaining the meaning of something, right? So we need to either explain what it means or we need to have analysis, which would be detailed examination of the structure. So we're going to go structure. We're going to talk about the language that the author is using. So what does he mean when he says we deceive ourselves about our values? So the deception, I'm going to bold it so you can see what I'm adding. So here's my explanation of the quote. This is my interpretation, my analysis of why they're using the word deception, right? So the deception the author is referring to includes lying to ourselves and lying to others. We spend so much time creating a certain public version of ourselves, we can often forget who we really are. So now that's our, additional elaboration. And then do this. What other evidence can you add? Return to step one, repeat the process. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to take a part of this blue quote that I just turned blue, and I'm going to add it into the response. So revelation that those outside of our echo chamber may also be more complicated. So outside our echo chamber might also be more complicated. We're going to take that phrase, and then we're going to add more evidence. So that's a short phrase from the green box above. Outside our echo chamber might also be more complicated. It's 9, close enough, same deal. So next step, so we have that short phrase that we're adding. We're surrounding it by quotation marks. We trimmed it to the right length. Now, is the evidence properly introduced? Not yet. So we're going to add 2 to 3 sentences before. So we're going to revisit the prompt to make sure that I'm actually answering the question being asked. So the prompt was right here, and we are missing the second part of it. So we talk about the stories we tell being influenced by our values, but we need to address echo chambers and what we should keep in mind when we learn about the experiences of others. So when we learn about the experiences of others, we must remember that others do the same mental editing to their stories, to their own stories, right? That's kind of the point. So if we limit ourselves only to other opinions like ours inside of our echo chambers, connecting back to the prompt, we sometimes forget that other perspectives are also valid. It is a good habit to remember that outside our echo chamber might also be more complicated than we are aware of. So building up to the quote, including the shortened quote, still finishing the sentence in my own words so that you don't hear the quote, and then really bringing it home, right? Tying it back to so why do we care? So this can be the first step to broadening our horizons and finding common ground with others on difficult topics. So looking at this all together, we have a drastically different This is the student response that I started with. There's a quote here, but it's just a whole sentence. It's just dropped there. So the response at the bottom, what we end up with, extremely changed, right? Everything that's bolded was added. I expanded it. I trimmed the quotes down. I added more evidence. I made it to where the quotes flow seamlessly if you read that all out loud. So here's an example as quick as I could make it, going from the top, following the steps, including more evidence, resulting in revision down at the bottom. Hopefully that helps.